Good morning. This is Jay Peterson with the State Library of Iowa, and thank you for coming to our presentation on youth services and autism spectrum disorder for Kids First 2020. And we will head off here and we'll get the slides rolling. We were hoping to share this comic this morning, but we will have resources, of course, later. We encourage you to go Google this this comic, take a look at it at some point. It's a pretty long comic from this artist, but I think I pulled probably one of the more interesting things to discuss when we're talking about autism and people with autism, is that you hear a lot about it being a spectrum. And I think this comic did a good representation of talking about how it's not so much a spectrum as it is almost like a color wheel. It's not just a line, it's not that every person is extremely autistic or somewhere not very. There's a lot of different areas and a different set that neurodiverse people have. And I think this kind of is a very good representation of kind of where that is, and that a person with autism may have really good language skills, but have totally different sensory functions than somebody else, and that's really important to consider when we're talking about autism. So that was kind of a brain buster for our first comic for our morning, but it was very hard to put the link to this in chat and have you all see it. So I may do that towards the end if you want to take a look at it before you leave. So I wanted to talk a little bit about our presenters this morning. I am the North Central District Library Consultant with the State Library of Iowa. So that's mostly the libraries around the Mason City area. And we also want to talk to you about things we kind of do when we're not at our jobs and things we advocate for. So I've worked on bus rider transit advisory boards here in Des Moines for a period of years, chaired a group about that. And now I'm working with various advisory committees at the Des Moines Public Schools about their building projects and their superintendent plan, superintendent space planning as well. And I want to introduce Kate Thompson, who's another co-presenter here with us today.
Good morning, everybody. I'm really excited to be here today and to be sharing some of this information with you. I enjoy doing autism advocacy work. I got involved when my son was diagnosed. And one of my favorite organizations that I've worked with is the Iowa Family Leadership Training Institute, which trains family members and self-advocates to be advocates at the state and federal level. And I was inspired by going to story time with my son and seeing how he was struggling to go back to school. I'd had a career in nonprofit management, and I went back to school to get my MLIS, and my emphasis is in youth services, and my main interest is in programming for Autism Spectrum Disorder. And I'm currently working at the West Des Moines Public Library as an adult services assistant.
And so also I'd like to introduce my wife, Marjorie Best-Peterson. So take it away.
Hi, everybody. I'm Marjorie, and I'm the Children's Program Specialist at the Pleasant Hill Library. I've been in that position for about a year, but I've been at the library for about 4 years. Outside of work, I'm an active PTA board member, and until I went back to work, was very active in a mom's group here in Des Moines, which is how I met Kate. And kind of like Kate, I became very interested in children's programming, seeing my son struggle as well in story times. And it's definitely something that fuels how I do my programs now.
Thank you very much. And just to cover our learning objectives today, we're hoping that you come away from this understanding opportunities that libraries provide to create community for families that receive therapy services or benefit from sensory-friendly programming. We're also hoping you gain practical tips on programming for that will suit children with specific needs and supporting caregivers. And just in general, I mean, obviously, this is a huge topic. You're not going to be able to know everything about it in a day, but this is just hoping you gain some broad understanding of the autistic community, and creating a welcoming environment in your library. So a little bit about our inspirations. I talk about that's my son Joel. I think we maybe had a formal diagnosis when he was about 4 years old of his autism there, and that's our us with our daughter Marley. But we've worked a lot with the schools and learned a lot of coping tips over the years to with him and his autism journey, if you will. And I'd like to Kate take a second to talk here. So.
That is my son, the cat up in the middle. That's Whitman. I like that picture because he developed an interest in cats when he was about a year old, and now he's 9, and that's still his overriding passion that drives just about everything that he does. That other picture is him with my younger son, Carl, who's neurotypical. That picture also made me smile because he knew that I wanted to get a picture where they were both looking at the camera, but he really hates making eye contact, so he's kind of taking his chin and like trying to look at the camera for me. It's very sweet.
And I wanted to talk a little bit about a passion of mine when I talk to libraries about them being one of the third spaces left in our communities and our world, and how we kind of fit. And it's my portion here to kind of talk about the role that libraries play in society for that. And when you kind of delve into literature, looking into this concept, libraries come up as a place that helps build community. And, sometimes it's referred to as an anchor institution as well, along with, churches and schools and things like that. In general, a third space is anything that's not your home or your place of business, or in part a school, because, for children, that they're going to their public school most of the time, although I did not think when we started writing this that we'd be in quite the situation we are now, where our home is our school for a while here for a lot of kids. But it's a very interesting concept because it's kind of how, when you get into this, it's like how the world and the economy has kind of compressed, and how the globalization of the economy has kind of made everything faster and more compressed, and we have this delivery and just in time, and our public spaces have changed greatly, and we've all kind of seen those effects lately too of what happens to our public spaces. But our populations are very mobile, they're fragmented, they're looking for things to anchor them in their communities, and libraries are a big part of that. So they're wonderful in that there's no expectation that you have to have money to use a library. They're a public library. You don't have to go there and buy something. No one's going to say, well, you got to buy a latte before you can sit here for half an hour. I mean, I think that's a wonderful thing about public libraries still. And youth services, especially in our public library, are, kind of onboarding people to the use of public libraries, especially if you heard the presentation from Don this morning. He actually talked about, that libraries were important to him, that, you needed that place to kind of get connected. And so, we'll talk about that a little bit here, about how libraries help you onboard people in your society. So I've came across this great article from James Elmborg. He actually wrote this when he was working at the University of Iowa Library Science School, but he now works at the University of Alabama as the Dean of Library Studies there. But if you're getting into the nitty-gritty of a library and working in the library, you kind of think of these two modes of practice for librarianship. So the first order is, the librarian is instructing people on how to use the library, how to use the codes of that space. You know, you're part of the machine of that library. And this I think is very much the stereotype we've all seen, dealt with, operate under. I mean, it's the first thing anyone says when you say you're a librarian or you work in a library, is that, you know, you're the shushing librarian, the policing librarian. You're telling people not to read books. It's in all the movies, all the TVs. But in reality, we're much more in this second mode of librarianship. I think all of us are in the modern era in libraries, that we're trying to be a companion guide for people coming in on board. And, you know, I think that's really inspiring that you're part of a big, a game, a quest, an adventure, especially in children's librarianship. You know, you're getting kids to use their imagination. You're driving them along, and showing them what, you know, reading can be, that it can be a good experience, that, you know, group play is important, you know, all these wonderful things we all love about libraries, and library events. So I like this concept too. The view from the library is a perspective of the cultural other. The librarian becomes the cultural worker, aware of the cultural and personal borders, aware of the nature of people as constantly between stages of development, struggling toward fulfillment. So I think that's a big, I highlighted the word personal borders. That's a big part of what we're talking about with patrons that have, are on the that have autism, that they're dealing with, you know, lots of issues with trying to deal with public space in general, trying to deal with, you know, all those different challenges. And, you know, the more librarians can help them realize that, you know, librarians can be welcoming to them as well. That's a big deal. So I thought that was important. So I wanted to talk to you a little bit about some of the more literature you can use, or kind of some things you can distill for policy guidance, or kind of how you're operating your library. And I came across the Libraries Transform Family Engagement Toolkit, and I like their 5 R's. I wanted to just cover them a little bit. So, you know, they covering reaching out, raising up, reinforcing, and relating and reimagining. So obviously reaching out is important, reaching out to libraries in special circumstances, you know, and promoting people using the library. Raising up, you know, trying to improve programs, services, elevate family perspectives in the library. And trying to work with families, support learning, reinforcing good, you know, early literature, that sort of thing. And, you know, relating to your patrons, relating to your customers as best you can, finding opportunities to build those relationships. There's a huge part of creating that community. And, you know, I think if you listen to Don too this morning, I mean, it's a lot of reimagining as well, looking how libraries fit into culture, where children's literature fits into culture. So I think it's a lot of really great cultural stuff that we're doing in libraries with youth. So if you ever seen the Libraries Transform flyers that they kind of do, they always have these kind of because statements, and this is from their page there. And so if you can see, this sure blocked me, I can't even read that. But, you know, so kind of starting in the lower corner here, you know, because community supports helps parents thrive. You know, this is kind of, they're saying, you know, why do we have a library? Because community support helps parents thrive. You know, you know, we all kind of want that in our youth services, that parents are coming in, you know, using the library better. Parents need a place to connect as well. That's an important part of this. You know, that's what that upper slide says. And then the last one, you know, we want to welcome families from all backgrounds, all, you know, families that have all kinds of needs. We want to be welcoming to all those people in our community. So this is also a flyer. They had ALA had the family engagement toolkit. So this is a 2-page flyer, and I just shamelessly stole their graphics and broke it into 2 pieces. So I thought these elements were a pretty good distillation of what we're hoping the libraries are doing. So that center part, you know, the librarians are engaging with the 5 R's. And then, you know, you're getting support from your leadership that's, you know, supporting your endeavors to do things like sensory story times and things like that. You know, and they're also learning to improve their services as well, and learning new ways to interact with their patrons. and even the collection space. So, you know, Linda's saying this is a support services, and we'll cover this a little bit about space engineering in the library, you know, talking about signage, talking about all these things, and also trying to work on your collections as well. You could do a whole course too about, you know, how to, and, you know, do collections that are assisting all this, people who need services that are in therapy like this. So, you know, and the technology portion as well, you know, what are you doing in your library that's conductive to these things? So, so these are the outcomes they're hoping for. I wanted to kind of talk about where the families are in this without going way into all these, but, you know, hopefully at the end of this, you know, your efforts to do these 5 R's will have the families, you know, spread out in their communities and draw more people into the library. You know, when they know about those resources that the library has, you know, they find a support network with other parents that are out there. You know, we're really hoping, because that community word of mouth makes a big difference. And, you know, I think we can say typically that, you know, parents of special needs children, you know, they're pretty active in their communities. They have a lot of groups they're involved in. And so having the public libraries, you know, work with them closely is good for everyone. So I think this was a good little flyer, something to talk about with your staff. So this is Kate's section here, and I'm going to pass it over to her.
Sure. Thanks again, everybody, for joining us today. You might have noticed so far that we've kind of used a number of different terms for talking about autistic people. And I wanted to just touch on that briefly. And my intention is not to intimidate you with thinking that you need to do everything perfectly and phrase it perfectly, but just to give you an understanding that language is a really constantly evolving issue in this community. You might think of it as being similar to the LGBTQIA community, where there's a lot of evolution going on. And in general, person-first language, which used to be preferred by clinicians and therapists, and sometimes parents and caregivers, is giving way to identity-first language. And so an example of that would be referring to someone as an autistic person. And that's similar in the movement within the deaf community to refer to people as deaf people rather than someone with deafness. And the sort of philosophical distinction is that we're thinking of autism as an integral part of somebody's makeup and not something that could be cured. And that if that part was taken away, they wouldn't, in essence, be the same person. My partner is also autistic, and that's his language preference, so that's what I tend to lean towards. But I want you to be aware that everyone has their own preference. Certainly parents do as well. So in bold, and, you know, ask your patron for their language preference is always the way to go. Also, you may be aware, but I think this term is really still around. Asperger's syndrome no longer exists technically in the DSM-5. That was replaced in 2013. Autism Spectrum Disorder is the umbrella term that covers what would have formerly been known as Asperger's. Sometimes people will use that as sort of a shorthand way of saying they think someone is higher functioning. So I'll hear that a lot, like, oh, that person must have Asperger's. It's really best to avoid the high or low functioning label. It's not really necessary in our role to try to determine what someone's deficits are. I think it's better to focus on what their strengths are, and particularly what their interests are, because that's a great way that we can connect as librarians. We have this wealth of information and resources, and not all, but a lot of autistic people have really intense passions and are really interested, maybe beyond a neurotypical level, in certain topics and really digging in deep in research. So that's a great thing that we have to offer to this community as librarians. We talked a little bit about the physical space, and I wanted to start with just some easy ideas. These are things that, you know, just give a sign to families that, oh, you're being thought about here. We've talked about you. You're welcome in the library. And one is to create some visual signs. Something that autistic people can struggle with is knowing what the unwritten social cues are. And so just making things more explicit about what the rules are at the library. For example, you might use the one on the left as a place where you're, if there's an eating area or there's a section of the children's area that has toys and it's more appropriate to, have a level of conversation. And then the sign on the right could be maybe where your computer carols are or another place that you'd like to reserve for quiet study. And so then a next step up from that would be a great project to do, maybe over the winter, is creating a social story. And not just libraries, but all kinds of organizations use these, including schools. So it's something that the families are already familiar with and maybe looking for. It's something you can create to put on your library's website or to have paper copies of. And basically, it's a really short picture book that you create that shows the important places in your library and, again, the important rules for your space. And I've got a couple examples here from the Millbrook Library, and I've included the link there if you want to check out the full thing. This is just the opening page. So you want to give a sense of what the space looks like. Include some smiling staff faces is always great. And one thing that is a really nice feature is to have a place that people can go if they just need a little bit of a sensory break. And so here, as you can see, it's nothing too fancy, but there's a couch provided, there's a patio area. So give people an idea, parents as well, where they can go if they're overwhelmed in the library. So this is great, not only for autistic people, but also just for anyone who maybe has some library anxiety. This is something people can review before they even visit for the first time. And it just helps set up your expectations. At the West Des Moines Library, we're in the process of remodeling right now. And so we have the privilege of being able to think ahead about what our quiet space will look like. And so it's going to be a multi-purpose room where people can pray, parents can breastfeed, feed their children, and also where we are going to have, some fidget toys, a comfortable place to sit. But even if you don't have that, or even if you don't have a little couch space, think about when you're doing a program, how you could get another room that's nearby and set up something like that so you can refer families to that space if they need a break, or even within the same space, a beanbag chair and a few toys. It's really just about giving that psychological room. And the other thing it does, we've talked about this a little bit, the three of us, is that we really like knowing from the person doing a program that they understand our family's needs. And so letting people know at the beginning that you understand that kids might move around, the way that different kids learn might look different. They might make a level of noise, or letting them know that, hey, if you need to leave and take a walk around, don't feel like you've missed too much of the program, you're always welcome back in. Just sending some of those signals is really great to make families feel welcome. We included that cartoon because it just kind of nicely shows that, oh, well, when the child there is looking away, they're actually taking in this information, but it is harder when you get that double sense of information where you're also trying to make contact and understand what's going on socially. It's actually harder to understand the content of what's being said. So everybody learns a little bit differently. Along those notes, making your programs predictable. I think a lot of Storytime librarians already do this, where they are letting you know what's going to happen next. And that's great for a lot of kids, whether autistic or not, but it can be really helpful just to make things predictable. And so it doesn't have to be a felt board, or even you can get clip art, which is great. But it doesn't even have to be that fancy. Just getting a whiteboard and drawing some, little cartoons, maybe a hand that says, this is where we do our hello song. This is where we read our story. And then this is where we say goodbye for the day. That could really help us walk through the program. I'm going to talk a little bit more in depth about some programs that I've done. I worked through ALSC, the ALSC mentorship program, which was really wonderful experience for me. And I was partnered with a mentor, Maria Papanastasiou from Arlington Heights Memorial Library. which is a Chicago suburb. So they have a pretty large library with a nice budget. And she recently won the I Love My Librarian Award for some of the work that she's done there. And so you can read in detail about all the things that they do. But they have a number of programs which are enveloped within our time. And as you see, it says Children in Therapy and You. That is kind of the language that we settled on to be a little more inclusive. So we don't want people to feel like, oh, my kid would love that sensory-friendly program, but her diagnosis is not autism spectrum disorder. So by using that sort of more inclusive language, partnered with a really detailed description of what the program is, that's something that we've found successful. So instead of us trying to figure out who's the audience and how do we target it exactly, we create the program and then are very clear about what it is and that everyone's welcome. And of course, siblings are welcome too, so that the whole family can participate. So we had a program, Caregivers, Coffee and Play, which was, as Jay sort of touched on, that's the social networking piece for parents and caregivers. And that's more focused on their socializing. And then a developmental play group where they had some therapists from the community would come in and would be spending time with the children, and the parents are still also getting that social side. Our big brainstorm that we wanted to share that you might be able to replicate was doing a tandem program. And this came out of just talking with parents and realizing that they enjoyed that adult education aspect, but it's very hard to get childcare and not always reliable. So we decided to have two programs going on at once in the same room. We have our IEP, Individualized Education Program, paperwork organizing on one side of the room, and then we had a Lego party with one of the library staff for the youth on the other side of the room. So they got to do something fun and interesting, but as a parent, we still got to see that the kids were doing okay, they were having a good time, and so, but you're able to focus on something else. So we provided binders and tabs and tips from understood.org about different disorders and helped just give them some time to do some organizing. Moving forward, we're working on a program called Science Circle, where again, we're focusing on the program rather than the audience and hoping that the audience will come. And it's built around an interest in science, and we have different members of the community come in who, like a Lego users group, podcasters, engineering group, come in and speak monthly on a topic, but then have the same group of youth and caregivers coming every month. So there's sort of a dual purpose there of socializing and networking, having something interesting for the kids, but then also doing an adult education piece as well. And finally, I wanted to touch on sort of the bigger picture of how you can create a welcoming environment. And I think really involving the lived experience is the best way to get more neurodiversity in your library. And that starts with hiring autistic employees. So you might consider thinking through how your hiring process works currently and what the values are that are shown by that. And I think it's easy for us to sometimes not think about what the struggles might be when someone is applying. For example, if you have had some in-depth conversation about what accommodations you can make or have made in the past, that's a great thing to articulate in job descriptions and when you're sending out announcements for positions that you're willing to accommodate, and be specific about here are some of the things that you're willing to do, or at least say, we're very willing to have a conversation about necessary accommodations. That can sometimes get you a pool of applicants that you might not have seen otherwise. Make the process more accessible. For example, at the West Des Moines position that I currently have, rather than a first round phone interview, there was a short answer, email back your short answers about customer service. And so that really gives people a chance to take their time. If you struggle with social anxiety, you have an opportunity to really show yourself off in a great way without the social pressure of that first phone call. And then, of course, once you have the autistic employees, make sure to involve them in decision making, because the lived experience will be the most powerful tool that you have. Along those lines, when you do programs, it's so important to check back in. Marjorie will talk about this a little bit too, that you want to make sure that the people you're aiming for, that you're creating programs that work for them. You know, if you're doing quiet browsing hours, some families with special needs have a really hard time getting up and out the door in the morning. It can take a long time. So 8 a.m. Saturday might not be the best time for that audience. So one way that you can find out things like that is creating an advisory board. And that could be as small as 2 or 3 people that meet 2 or 3 times a year. It doesn't have to be a huge organization. Do remember that for these families, their time is very compressed. So sometimes doing remote meetings like we're doing right now, or checking in over email rather than trying to catch them after a program might be more successful. But in general, families are so grateful for these programs. I know my family is. We're usually more than happy to weigh in and spend some volunteer time helping you improve what you're doing. So that's the end of my portion. Thank you so much.
Hey everybody, I kind of wanted to talk a little bit today about the experiences I had as a parent and now kind of evolving into running my own programs. I did, however, happen to think of something when Kate was speaking about the labeling of folks, that when our son was diagnosed, I think about 6 years ago, he's 10 now, I remember they told us that he was high functioning autistic. If it would have been earlier, he would have been considered to have Asperger's. And I got to thinking, that was only 6 years ago. We already had 2 outdated terms. So it changes quickly. And so hang in there. Don't get too hung up on it. Our son, who has autism, was our first child, and he and I started attending baby rhyme time at the downtown Des Moines library branch about when he was 4 months old. It became a huge outlet for me as a parent, and I also think it was nice to have him look and see something else other than the inside of our house. And it was a very wonderful outlet for us both. However, as he started aging into the toddler time and becoming more active and having a bit more mobility, I could definitely see there was going to be some challenges for us. I very much felt pressure as a parent to have him sit, have him pay attention, have him listen. And I was trying to squeeze him into the mode of the story time that I thought he should be in. We often had trouble if there were too many kids there. It was way overstimulating and he could become a behavior problem. However, if things moved too slowly, that was also a behavior problem. We quickly knew a diagnosis was probably coming. And even long before we had him diagnosed, I couldn't stress with you how much the kindness that I received from the librarians was such a relief for me as a parent. And it's definitely something that I try to keep in mind when I'm running my own programs now. And when we started therapy with our son too, so many of the skills and the coping tools and social stories we learned had already been implemented by the librarians that I was seeing in these story times. And often so many of these tools are, honest to gosh, just simple kindness and willingness to learn from this child. And again, as I stated, the librarians were such a lifeline to me at this stage. Again, I tried to get him to follow the program as it was. It was the librarians who were saying, let him roam about. It's okay. He's still learning. He's still hearing. He's still absorbing the program. And I kind of didn't believe them. But sure enough, as they kept on coming back, after being encouraged week after week, he was starting to learn the process of the story time. And little by little, he was engaging more with the program. But that being said, if he got up and went to his little corner in the story time room, it was not something that was needed to be corrected. And I, again, it was nice to know I was in a safe space, that I wasn't having a librarian going, my goodness, can't she control her child? And there was just a lot of great information that I gathered from these times. And now I get to use those to try to incorporate acceptance into my story times. When I first took over the position as a children's programmer at the Pleasant Hill Library, this was my director wanted to try to start incorporating more programs for folks with autism spectrum disorder. And this was a valuable tool that I used. It's Programming for Children and Teens with Autism Spectrum Disorder. It's by Barbara Clipper, and it kind of goes a bit more into the nuts and bolts about how to have programs, things that are successful. I highly recommend checking it out. I think there's about 6 copies on Silo. And also, we ordered our copy through Amazon to have at our library for resources. So I do highly recommend it. And I think there's another issue coming out somewhat soon. When we tried to start to making our events more inclusive, the first thing we thought was, well, great, everybody's doing these early morning browsing times. Unfortunately, we have not been very successful in that program. I'm hoping that's something that can change over time. But there are also other separate events you can do. There's the sensory-friendly times, browsing times, support for caregivers, like Kate mentioned before, about having the dual programs. However, just look at the needs in your community and see, what space you could fill the need for. I know that I was so excited about having my first 9 a.m. Saturday browsing hour. I had my sensory tables all set up. I had these programs. I had my storyboard ready, and I was kind of crushed that no one was there. But I'm using those now to incorporate into our everyday activities, everyday programs. And so a lot of things I kind of gather for this special story time, I kind of have on hand for our regular story time and also any other programming. And I kind of recommend that every librarian kind of have this in their back pocket so that you have the tools when you need them rather than, trying to scramble to get the tools gathered. I love the social storyboarding. I think it's great. And just a simple clip art, have a clip art person singing a song. That's our welcome song. Next is a person reading a book. You would read a book next. And also I would have fidgets available. This could be something as simple as a scarf, or I particularly love from a few years back for the Build Your Own World, they were squeezy Lego blocks, and those are great because they're nice and soft. And also keep in mind too that if there's one kid that can benefit from a fidget, there's still going to be lots of other kids that might be more neurotypical but are still going to want the thing that everybody has. So just kind of have these things in your back pocket. I know for my son, he was definitely a roamer, and this was a tool that they used a lot in his preschool. It was just a simple stop sign. Just a lot of kids know what a stop sign is. And, a stop sign on, the area, the story time room where they shouldn't go, or a cabinet, a lot of times kids will, oh, it's a stop sign, it's not for me. And you'll kind of learn as you're dealing with these patrons what works best. And the biggest thing is just to be flexible. And you will start to see these little things that will work best for some patrons. And I know some kids with autism sounds could be difficult. Our son was absolutely terrified of the see and say sheep sound on the little farm toy. So, if you're playing a song, it could be something very terrifying to a child. Don't be afraid to stop it right there. Don't try to stick to your plan. And also sometimes too, kids that have trouble roaming or paying attention or being involved, assign them a task. Can you hand out these shakers? And it could be just the thing that they need to kind of pull them in. And also with any kind of craft you have, be sure you have just in mind about activities for different abilities. Is cutting going to be really difficult for some child? Make sure you either have an alternative or are able to help them more one-on-one. And don't be afraid to ask for feedback. Any existing patrons you have, I know when I first started being a children's programmer, I knew what I liked as a parent, but I didn't know if that was what the patrons were looking for. And so I would, a couple of weeks ask, how was that today? Do you prefer this order? What do you think? And that's kind of good advice for anything, just being willing to see what the patrons are looking for. And also surveys. Project Outcome is a great resource. They can help you create online surveys. And don't be afraid to contact your local schools or area education agencies and see, again, do you have a special ed class? Is that something that we could, help you help fill in a void that they might have? Sorry, I have a child coming through. I'm getting distracted. And the area education agency can also provide extra resources for you. So maybe you could have an event where you could maybe bring in a speaker or something. And I know here in the Des Moines area, we have Child Serve and also Balance Autism. And those were both organizations that I sent out information. Hey, we're offering these services. Would you please promote them to your families that use your services? And overall, be welcoming, be approachable, and be willing to work with these patrons, especially, you know, the parents of these kiddos. If it's a new diagnosis, they might be feeling uneasy. Make sure that they know that the library is a safe space and that you are willing to work with them to make it a positive experience for both them and their child. And I especially would love to hear from any libraries that have had really successful programs where they were able to get lots of people to attend, because this is definitely a group of people that I would like to cater to, and I'm working around myself to try to find the best way to do that. So I'd love to hear extra ideas.
Okay, yeah, thanks. Thanks, Marjorie. Thanks, Kate. And we're just kind of opening up the questions at this point. I think we got, that ended pretty much perfectly. We left about 15 minutes to kind of talk and have questions and be online here together at Kids First. And but we will, I don't know whether I should stop share or not. I'll open up the chat window here for one thing. And we did have a question, things from Laura, and she actually used to work at Arlington Heights Library, so that was very nice. But she was, she was making a comment about the language too, and I think I definitely struggle with that too, and I think it's just being open and willing and trying to, do your best to, be welcoming, and I think you'll find that, they're happy to have the interactions. They're happy to have a place to be. Communication is key. That always it's a no-brainer there in terms of your customer service and patron services. So there's anything else from the group? You can open up your mics, and we'd love to hear from you. And we hope you're here, with some background to this. So.
I guess I kind of wanted to reiterate something that Kate had mentioned earlier too, about be careful of your labeling of programs, because I know as a parent, I always kind of think, is this special needs? Is it okay that we go? Is these special needs enough? So I do love the title of Kids in Therapy. I think that's a great way to handle it. Or, and also I have to think too, are we going to have, who is your audience basically? So kind of keep that in mind when you're doing your marketing.
How do you deal, I'm not sure who youth is, sorry. But they were saying, how do you balance a wandering child with those that sit still? That's a great question. Anyone have any thoughts on that?
I know personally, I am a person who I let the kid wander. However, if the child is a wanderer, I always make sure that the parents know we can close the door, and I put a sign on the outside, hey, story time's in session, come on in. So anyone late knows that they can. It is a kind of a slippery slope when you also do have a wanderer that could possibly be disruptive to the other kids. And that would be when I would try to maybe get a fidget, hey, could you hold this for me? Or maybe perhaps give them a task, of we're going to need 10 scarves. Can you count out 10 scarves from this bag? So it's something you kind of have to, know a little bit of the child to see what would work best. And also talk to the parent, hey, they're kind of being disruptive. What could we do to keep them engaged?
The next question about is from, and I wanted to say too that the youth was Diane from Waterloo. Thanks, Diane. So we had a question here from, where'd the question go? Kay Becker. And this is something you could have done a whole class just on this and space planning. And to be honest, that was something we were all getting into. We were all going to start working on space planning. We had a speaker scheduled, and we were going to send people, and I was going to go, and that's been canceled. So we're going to be working on that. Yeah, if you have a giant open space, and I have a lot of libraries that are in that boat, it's just one, it's like a straight shot down. It's like a building storefront, and it's really hard to make a non-disruptive use space in there or give kids a quiet space. I mean, not every library has nooks and crannies like some of ours do. That's really not an easy one to do. If there's any way you can talk to admin to work on building a wall, building a better space. I mean, I see that all the time. That's a big, huge complaint. They say our library does not have a use space. It does not have anything we can cut off. It does not have a community room. I mean, it's just, that's a real struggle. I admit that design is tough. If you can, but I will say for making a little breakout space, if you're thinking real big about having a place for kids to go in the library, it can literally be just a few beanbags around a corner with some bookshelves near it. That can make all the difference. Something to just kind of be a demarcation line and say, okay, this is I'm going to chill out space, and that can make a little kid real comfortable. I mean, I know it worked for our children. They put them in our preschools, all had them to little safe zones with a few little soft spaces to be. And I admit that's tough. I'm not sure. Okay, thanks for your question. And I don't know what to do about parents yelling from kids. Other parents parenting. That's a tough one. For sure. I don't have a good answer for that, Diane, either. Trying to encourage the parents to work together. I don't know. We all have little kids here. We all have toddlers. Let's make it, happy for them. And do you have a good thought on that, Marjorie? Yeah, setting the status, the expectations. I think that really helps if everyone kind of knows. We're used to kids running around. Yeah.
If you're having difficulties with, the parents correcting being the distraction, it's probably a conversation to have with the parent and try to come up with a plan involving the parents. Because I have a couple too who the parent correction is way more distracting than the child's behavior. And that also might be something to kind of reassure them, because I was the correcting parent. So like, they're okay. Like, let them go, let them and do that, and it's just kind of, it's a moving target, something you have to constantly adjust. Good luck.
Yeah, I got set this message privately, so I don't know if she wants me to mention it, but the city, she says the city had a private group start for parents and caregivers of children with autism. So it's not associated with the library, but somehow connected to the city. So I don't know. I think that's a wonderful, that's great that program is there. Just maybe be open to, can I speak to your group about what we offer, what we want to do, and what we want to work with you? I mean, I'm a big fan of putting yourselves out there and asking for time to say, listen, this group meets every month. Can I go to one of their meetings, get on their agenda, and promote the library to this group? I mean, that's a great idea for any of these things, though. If you got homeschooler groups or anything like that meet regularly, try to get
and to look for the social media pages for those groups as well can be helpful. There's here in our area, there's a Facebook group for Central Iowa Autism, and so maybe if to the last point there, if emails don't seem to be read, sometimes that can be helpful if it's just something coming across your radar a few days beforehand. There was a question about sensory-friendly movie. Yeah, that can be frustrating when you set it up and you only have one patron. And just as an example, here in Des Moines, the Civic Center has started doing sensory-friendly programming, but it's open to all. And so there's 2 performances of a lot of the children's shows, and the second performance is sensory-friendly. And they just let everyone know what's going to happen. And so everyone in the community is welcome to attend. and you just understand that the lights are going to be less dark, that there might be more activity in the seats. And so that might be something to think about for when you're doing movie programming, is just letting those expectations be out there and consider having the lights higher, having the sound of the movie a little lower, and see if you can strike a balance where, rather than setting up a sort of a siloed program, you're making it more accessible in your general programming.
Kate, a question from R. Francis just came on. Can you talk about same time programming? You know, your binder, the IEP, that event. You know, the parents did not leave the space; they were in the same
Right, the
space.
parents were still in the space, and that seems to make everyone more comfortable. The kids can still see their parents, and then if the parents are concerned about behavior or whether the kid's comfortable, they're still keeping an eye on it. We tried to make one of the programs more structured than the other. Certainly it's hard to have both of them have much structure. So in the case of the Lego party, there were some activities and challenges for the children, but a lot of free play as well. And then the parents it was pretty loose. You know, we had a slideshow of ideas. People are setting up their binders, but it's not like you have two programmers who are trying to speak at the exact same time in the same space. So I would suggest that if you're doing that you either focus on the parent education and have the programming be more loose, a sensory exploration or something like that for the youth, or the other way around, have more of a program for the kids and have it be more of a social time for the parents.
I wanted to
If you
go
have more
back.
questions about that, let me know.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, Kate. I got two things I wanted to roll together from the comments there. Someone was talking about, you know, if you're having space issues, investing in more movable furniture, that can be huge. I definitely see, you know, very heavy furniture, very heavy tables. If you see modern furniture in a lot of public schools, it's very much more collaborative. They're able to move them around, move stations, and have that sort of thing. That's kind of a trend in libraries as well. So if you get the wherewithal to get new tables, new things like that, as mobile, as light as possible, as easy to move around, but still be hardy to withstand interactions, that can be huge. Also, someone saying, you know, oh, put some painter's tape on the floor. I mean, heck, great idea. Go for it. Painter's tape is cheap. Kids love it. Here's a little X on the spot. It works so easy. Just kids say, okay, that's where you sit. I'm going to sit on this X. There you go. You know.
Another thought on the communication about the emails not being read is that, well, everyone gets a ton of email right now, but special needs families, especially, we get tons and tons of email from different organizations. So if you can have a list that you're giving it a title that makes it clear that this is a special program at the library, and it's going to look different than whatever listservs you're using or other methods coming from your library, it's more likely to be read. So that could be as simple as, once you get a family at a program, you know, give them a clipboard with a piece of paper and ask for their email and say, this is going to be a specific communication from us. So for example, at Arlington Heights, it was called Our Time. So that way, when you see the Our Time email, you know this is going to be something that's really germane to you, and you're more likely to get people to open and read. So
yeah, and that's another thing too. I could stress going physical as much as you can, in terms of, especially trying to get feedback. You know, you can hand them a slip of paper that has the survey stuff on it. Maybe get more luck than trying to have them fill out the survey while they're there or anything like that. You know, have a sign-in sheet, but make it real simple for people to do when they're scribbling, when they're trying to run between things. I mean, you know, if you can build a response group, you know, and if you get, you know, some people showing up and you only get 2 or 3 really good feedback people, those people could be really big champions for you. So, you know, it's hard to stress numbers. I mean, some people are, you know, oh, I only have 1 or 2 people show up, but you're making a big impact with those 1 or 2 people, especially when talking about who I'm usually working with, which are very small libraries. And they, you know, a lot of times I hear this, and maybe you'll hear this a lot today, Kids First, but, you know, say, oh, I had this event and it only had 20 people at it. And I'm like, that's a really massive turnout. You know, you can't compare yourself to the big urban libraries or something. And even they don't get massive numbers all the time. you know, so don't sell yourself short. You know, an event with 10 or 15 people is a huge success, you know, in a lot of cases, especially if it's something like this where there's maybe only 10 or, you know, there might be only 3 families in the whole town that are really looking, you know, a big part of the service. But you know, you'd gladly do the same service for, you know, you do a bridge club for 5 people in a small town. So it's all your community needs and what your community's after.
Yeah,
Okay.
ICPL there says that accessible programs are about quality, not quantity. I think that's a really important point. It's not a rush to create additional programs that might be hard to sustain, but start small, start simple and cheap, and you can
Mhm.
really, as you saw from the 3 parents here today, you can really make a difference in families' lives.
You know, the sensory story, you know, our little story times were maybe 6 or 7 people. It's not a, you know, I'm assuming many of you have not been to Des Moines Public in the Central Branch downtown, but that room is not big. It's not a huge, you know, they can do a big event, but the little times that they do, very, you know, small room, but it is isolated. It is nice when you can have that option to have a designated room and do a big event, you know, do a songs and story and dance, not have it all in a big room. You know, that is very tough.